You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode number 526 of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all. Thanks for tuning into the podcast.
As you guys will recall, with the last episode, we finished up talking about the attacks of the Federals' 15th, 4th, and 14th Corps at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain in Georgia on June 27, 1864. And we discussed the importance of troops from Schofield's Army of the Ohio using Sandtown Road to the south to work their way around the Confederate left flank that day.
And we said that by the end of the day on the 27th, since his frontal attacks against the Confederate lines had been uniformly unsuccessful, William Tecumseh Sherman had decided to put together a new plan to take advantage of the opportunity represented by Schofield's flanking maneuver.
Exactly. Well, Sherman was convinced reinforcing Schofield's success and moving around the Confederate left in strength would force Joe Johnston to either abandon his strong position at Kennesaw Mountain or remain in place and risk total defeat. But before Sherman could set his new plan in motion, he knew he'd have to spend a few days accumulating supplies so that he could cut himself off temporarily from the railroad and push large numbers of troops along the Sandtown Road.
Meanwhile, on the federal side, the survivors of the failed attacks tried to make the best of their situation for the rest of the day on June 27th. As battered units on the front lines tried to settle down and consolidate their positions, medical personnel behind the lines worked hard to care for the wounded.
Earlier that day, wounded men had begun to trickle back to the federal field hospitals by late morning. According to Captain Edward Moore of the 54th Ohio, who missed the attack because he was in one of those hospitals recovering from an illness, the wounded, quote, came in a steady stream from noon until dark.
Some of the federal wounded ended up in Confederate hands. The battlefield atop Cheatham Hill presented a horrible sight soon after McCook's and Mitchell's brigades fell back from their high tide. The bodies of dead Yankees lay within a few yards of the rebel works, and some were actually lying on the parapet, while the ground between the contending lines was littered with wounded Union soldiers.
Some of the wounded Federals tried to crawl back to the rise of ground where their comrades were using bayonets, cups, and tin plates to hastily throw up a low dirt berm to take advantage of the dead ground there. But many of the wounded lay where they were, waiting for darkness. In the meantime, the Confederates tried to take in as many Yankees as they safely could, calling on those close by to crawl over the parapet and into their trenches.
A number of Federals who weren't wounded but who had been stranded close to the Confederate works by the withdrawal of their comrades decided to give up. Sergeant John Baltley of the 52nd Ohio had found some degree of shelter right at the foot of the parapet, but soon realized rebels to his right could see and would fire at him if he tried to move, so he gave himself up and crossed the parapet into Confederate hands.
Quite a few wounded Federals also sought aid within the rebel lines. After 5 hours of laying wounded just 10 feet from the Confederate works, Adjutant Lansing Doughty of the 86th Illinois finally signaled to the rebels that he wanted help. They managed to help him across the parapet, and 4 of them carried Dottie on a stretcher several hundred yards to the rear of the salient, where a field hospital, quote, did thriving business.
When 17-year-old Private Newton Bostwick of the 52nd Ohio, who was badly wounded in the shoulder, tried unsuccessfully to cross the parapet, Sergeant James Jennings of the 1st Tennessee reached out to help him, but was shot in the neck. Surprisingly, both Bostwick and Jennings survived the incident.
Jennings even kept in touch with Bostwick for some time after, sending food to him in the hospital at Macon, Georgia, until the young Federal was exchanged. But there were limits to the risks Good Samaritans among the Confederates were willing to take to help wounded Yankees. Major John Yeager of the 121st Ohio lay wounded close to the rebels' works and called out to them for help. However, they deemed it too risky to try to reach him, and Yeager died that night. Sam Watkins of the 1st Tennessee remembered that several men of his regiment were shot when they tried to help the Federal wounded.
Both sides at Cheatham Hill kept up a pretty steady fire across no man's land that afternoon and evening. But after darkness had settled over the battlefield, some Federals ventured out looking for wounded comrades.
Edwin Payne of the 34th Illinois remembered how, quote, "It was a dangerous and gruesome undertaking. It was necessary to use the utmost silence and to creep close to the ground amongst the dead to find any that were living." F.M. McAdams of the 113th Ohio and 3 friends also crawled out under cover of darkness. They heard groans and located Sergeant Henry Scott, but while they managed to get him safely to the rear, Scott died the next day.
The butcher's bill for the Federals for June 27th amounted to 3,000 Federals killed, wounded, and missing, while Confederate losses were modest in comparison, amounting to around 700 casualties.
As we pointed out last week, that huge disparity between Federal and Confederate losses testifies to the strength of the rebel defensive position at Kennesaw Mountain, in particular, the effectiveness of their fortifications. Sherman admitted to Henry Halleck in Washington that his men, quote, inflicted comparatively little loss to the enemy, because the rebels, quote, lay behind well-formed breastworks.
On June 28th, the day after the failed attacks, Sherman continued to plan his next move. He reported to Halleck that, quote, it would not do to rest long under the influence of a mistake or failure, end quote. And so Sherman immediately set in motion the complicated task of moving toward the Confederate left and outflanking it.
Preparations lasted several days. Schofield's advanced position south of Kennesaw Mountain was the key to Sherman's plan. Sherman consulted with Army of the Cumberland commander George Thomas about the details of the move, since Sherman intended for Thomas's troops to cover McPherson's sector when McPherson's men pulled out and marched south to join Schofield.
Schofield would push south along Sandtown Road to create more space for McPherson's troops to come down and operate toward the railroad at Fulton. Thomas also was supposed to use Hooker's 20th Corps to cover the ground vacated by Schofield.
In essence, Sherman intended to use Thomas's command to hold virtually the entire present Federal position fronting the Confederates' Kennesaw line, while Schofield and McPherson conducted the flanking maneuver to the south. Then Thomas would follow them.
Sherman instructed McPherson, Schofield, and Thomas to accumulate 10 days' worth of supplies, including forage for the animals, in preparation for the movement. They were also to send back all wounded men, and most were shifted to a newly established hospital at Rome, Georgia.
The preparations fueled endless speculation in the Federal ranks. One of Brigadier General Absalom Baird's staff officers overheard a conversation between Sherman, Thomas, Hooker, and 14th Corps Commander John Palmer on the morning of June 28th, and he recorded, "I may say that something else will now be done, and if it's what I think it is, it will be one of the bold moves of the war."
In his memoirs, Sherman wrote that while George Thomas obediently participated in the preparations, the stolid commander of the Army of the Cumberland had his doubts about the plan. Quote, "General Thomas, as usual, shook his head, deeming it risky to leave the railroad, but something had to be done, and I had resolved on this move."
Before starting, it was also necessary to explain the plan to Henry Halleck in Washington, and Sherman did so on June 29th. He told Halleck he anticipated that the movement would, at the least, reach the railroad at Fulton, 10 miles south of Marietta, and he expected that turning the Confederate left flank would force Joe Johnston to fall back south of the Chattahoochee after abandoning his Kennesaw position.
Halleck relayed word from Ulysses S. Grant that Sherman was free to do as he thought best, and not to worry any longer about Johnston sending troops to reinforce Robert E. Lee in Virginia, since Grant thought Lee's supply difficulties were so great that the Confederates wouldn't send large numbers of troops from Georgia to Virginia, since they wouldn't be able to supply them.
Grant's encouragement to do as he thought best strengthened Sherman's resolve to risk the move toward Fulton, and Schofield was prepared to spearhead the move southward. His immediate objective was to push beyond Nickajack Creek and enlarge the area of Union control south of the Confederate position at Kennesaw, and to that end, Schofield began moving 23rd Corps at 6 a.m. on July 1st. The day before, on the afternoon of June 30th, before the movement toward Fulton began, and after a rain shower had passed through and cleared the atmosphere a bit, one of Schofield's signal officers climbed a tree on the high ground south of Ollie's Creek. From his perch, the man reported he, quote, could distinctly see Atlanta and the smoke from locomotives along the railroad.
Introducing Fidelity Trader Plus, the next generation of advanced trading from Fidelity. Customize your tools and charts and access them seamlessly across desktop, web, and mobile. For faster trades, anywhere you go. Try the all-new Fidelity Trader Plus. Learn more about our most powerful trading platform yet at fidelity.com/Trader Plus. Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC. Member NYSE, SIPC.
Walmart Business is in the business of saving you time, money, and hassle. Whether your business started in a garage or is a garage, Walmart Business has the tools to help you get where you're going. Tools like free shipping, multi-user accounts, and just about any item your company needs.
Even a double filtration cyclone dust collector.
Yep, even that.
Sweet.
Walmart Business. It's the Walmart you love. Now for your business. Learn more at business.walmart.com. Terms apply.
Tomorrow morning is knocking. Stock your fridge now. How about a creamy mocha frappuccino drink? Or a sweet vanilla? Smooth caramel maybe? Or a white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Find Starbucks Frappuccino drinks wherever you buy your groceries.
At the last minute, John Schofield brought up a possibility he thought worth mentioning to Sherman. What if, Schofield asked, Johnston reacted to the Federals' move toward Fulton by continuing to sit securely in his lines at Kennesaw while closing the approaches to his rear with additional fortifications, and thereby making a kind of citadel where he would wait out the Federals for 2 or 3 weeks?
Sherman told Schofield he wasn't worried about such a scenario. Quote, I hardly think he will be willing to have me interpose between him and the rest of the Confederacy. I am not bound to attack him in his position after getting below him, but may cross the Chattahoochee and destroy all his railroads before he can prevent it. Sherman admitted, though, that if Johnston decided to sit tight at Kennesaw and the Federals had to start destroying the railroad, then it would, quote, be a desperate game for us both.
When Schofield assured Sherman that he agreed with him and had simply wanted to alert him to all possibilities, Sherman replied, "I think I have contemplated every move on the chessboard of war, but am always much obliged for your full views."
While the Federals prepared for their move toward Fulton, Joe Johnston continued to search for ways to impair Sherman's ability to operate deep in Georgia. In particular, the Confederate commander was eager to find ways to threaten the Federals' tenuous supply line, and Joseph Wheeler, who commanded the Cavalry Corps of the Army of Tennessee, apparently came up with a plan to lead a considerable force of mounted men to raid the railroad behind Sherman. The problem was that Wheeler would need to strip the Confederate flanks of cavalry to undertake his expedition, and Joe Johnston was unwilling to take that risk.
If Joe Johnston didn't possess adequate resources to interrupt Sherman's logistics, then he wanted troops from other areas to help him. Unfortunately for the Confederates, there were no other troops to spare from other regions.
Both Jefferson Davis and Braxton Bragg repeatedly told Johnston that the disparity of numbers between the opposing forces in Georgia was less than that which existed elsewhere. For example, Major General Stephen D. Lee, who commanded Confederate forces in Mississippi, was in even more desperate need of reinforcements than Johnston. And then Robert E. Lee could certainly spare no troops from Virginia. And so the message was clear. Johnston couldn't count on help from anyone.
As Sherman was well aware, Johnston simply didn't have enough troops to hold the Kennesaw position and protect the railroad farther south than Marietta. In any case, in a letter to his wife Ellen on June 30th, Sherman made it clear that he had no intention of attacking fortified lines anymore, because, quote, "at this distance from home, we cannot afford the losses of such terrible assaults as Grant has made in Virginia."
In Sherman's view, a continuation of the state of affairs at Kennesaw would be pointless. The only way to avoid the possibility of having to attack the Confederates' fortified lines again was to make the flanking movement toward Fulton. And so, final orders for the move were issued on July 1st. They made clear that the objective of the maneuver was to get away from the formidable enemy works at Kennesaw and force Johnston, quote, to come out of his entrenchments.
Schofield was to move so as to command the ground between Ollie's Creek and Nickajack Creek. McPherson was to shift the Army of the Tennessee from its place on the Federal left, marching south to link up with Schofield, thus positioning a strong force that could move either toward the railroad at Fulton or toward the Chattahoochee, in case Johnston decided to fall back all the way to the river.
Meanwhile, George Thomas's Army of the Cumberland would arrange itself so as to carry on manning the lines north of Ollie's Creek and continue confronting the Confederates in their works. Kenner Girard's division of Thomas's Cavalry Corps would cover the roads leading from Allatoona toward Marietta. George Stoneman's cavalry division from Schofield's Army of the Ohio and Edward McCook's division of Thomas's Cavalry Corps would cover the Federal right flank beyond the infantry positions. To these orders, Sherman added a reminder that speed was essential to the success of the plan. Quote, "All movements must be vigorous and rapid, as the time allowed is limited by the supplies in our wagons."
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is Echoes of Glory, Illustrated Atlas of the Civil War by the editors of Time Life Books.
If you've been around a while, you know that Echoes of Glory is our go-to Civil War Atlas recommendation, and so we'll pull it out again here. If you're having trouble visualizing all the goings-on at Kennesaw Mountain, there's a few pages dedicated to the battle here in the chapter on the Atlanta campaign.
You can find a complete list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find information on joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way, just like Joseph D., Carson M., Logan D., and Jeff M. have all done recently.
A big thank you to them, and also to Hayron K. for their donation.
Then, as we wrap up this episode, we'll remind you that the music you hear at the start and at the end of every episode is from the song Midnight on the Water, and we use it with the kind permission of Spiritwood Music.
A big thank you to them, and also to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Rich and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.